Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I very much enjoyed the previous paper because in some sense it is also, I think, related to what I'm going to end up talking about, which is euthanasia laws, but of course within the context of, one might say, the understanding of reality that we have today. Well, this all started, the paper I did not intend to write, but it all started very recently because I had to deal with the very liberal euthanasia laws which have been enacted by the Canadian Parliament. Since 2016, assisted suicide has been legalized through a law entitled the Medical Assistance in Dying Law, otherwise known as MAID. The first version of this law had some barriers to assisted dying. It was restricted to those who were expected to die in the near future, but the most recent version of this law has no barriers except age of majority. Anyone over 18 may receive this procedure if they demand it. The decision is made between the physician and the patient, and privacy laws mean no one in the family is consulted. There is a very minimal level of psychological testing required to prove that the person is competent to make this decision. This is codified as a right to die and available in Belgium in different versions: Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, Netherlands, Oregon, and 9 other states, as well as Canada. And actually, I do recommend John Keown's book, Euthanasia, Ethics and Public Policy. He's at Georgetown and the Ethics Center, which actually goes through these laws and the various differences between them, as well as the consequences. Anyway, euthanasia, just to be clear, is defined as a deliberate decision to bring about death through the injection of a poisonous substance into the body. This is quite different from a valid medical practice, which might have the side effect of death, such as injecting a large dose of painkiller with the intent of helping the patient. And to oppose euthanasia does not require one to defend the use of life-prolonging procedures which are no longer helping the patient. There is a distinction, of course, between voluntary euthanasia, which is assisted suicide, and non-voluntary euthanasia, the most common being the benign neglect of defective infants in hospitals, so they die within a few weeks of birth. Now, the number of MAID deaths in Canada grew very quickly. I mean, in 6 years, enormous. How many deaths? I mean, the numbers are high, but how many deaths actually have resulted from MAID are unknown. A religious liberties lawyer in Canada told me that the death certificates often report MAID deaths as natural. It seems Canadians find this law acceptable, even compassionate, and the only objections raised are from people within the pro-life community. But from my own experience, a doctor who has moral reservations about referring a patient for an abortion would refer a patient for assisted suicide, so the bar is lower. My talk today is about why Western culture is welcoming a right to die, and I will suggest a new account of justice is at work, which has replaced the older Greco-Judeo-Christian account of justice. The substance of my argument relies heavily upon the writings of Canadian philosopher George Parkin Grant, who died in 1988. Insofar as healthcare is thought to include assisted suicide, the idea of justice at work must presume the idea that we should control our own lives medically until the very end. To account for this, Grant's work upon Heidegger and technological rationality is germane, as well as his work on Freud and Nietzsche. Heidegger had observed in his writings that human beings are beings towards death, not good or God, and Grant did not agree, and between those two ideas lies a great gulf. Technology, or technological rationality, Grant wrote, is not rightly characterized as simply the human capacity to invent new technologies, for men have been inventive from the beginning of time. Rather, its essential nature is marked by a new perspective upon nature, which is characterized by thinking that we have the power and freedom to command and control ourselves and our environment without restraint. The word technology itself reveals this novelty. Techne and logos, reasoning about making. Not reasoning to know, but directed to application. Technology in modern liberal society, he argued, emerged out of Western thought. Said, that's what Grant said. They do emerge out of Western thought, or at least aspects of Western thought, but exist in a very imperfect balance for obvious reasons. One might, of course, refer to Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, as an account of how our desire to control nature threatens our freedoms. Well, what was the older idea of justice? Well, Christ said, "Happy are those who are hungry and thirsty for justice." Christ, of course, is justice. Thus, his statement must be interpreted as meaning, happy are those who hunger and thirst for the cross, however that might be borne. His disciples suffered in his name, knowing that Christ's justice is beyond all bargains and without alternatives. But before Christ, Socrates said, it is better to suffer injustice than to inflict it. In the Gorgias, the Republic, the Crito, this teaching is repeated. When in the Republic, as you all know, Glaucon asked Socrates if justice is good in itself, beyond all reward or praise, beyond life itself, Socrates answers with an account of reality, the good, which is reality, which is also beyond all bargains or alternatives. And so for the lover of wisdom, Socrates, life was most fully lived as a way of life from which one learns how to die well. He added that, of course, only when political power and philosophy or love of wisdom become thoroughly blended together will cities have any rest from evil. Only when the ruler comes to know and act upon what Plato called the good will there be rest from evil. Inner and outer justice are inextricably linked. Even the pagan Socrates held that justice is openness to eternity and is something for which to suffer, and die. So this is a teaching which we're rejecting, which goes back to the very earliest of our philosophical thought. Thus, suffering manifested upon the cross and in a complex way linked to the teaching of Socrates about the centrality of wisdom to prepare for death, directed Christians to see that suffering and love of wisdom and love of Christ are all a preparation for death. Thus, the legalization of euthanasia indicates a fearful darkness in mind, heart, and spirit about the gospel, but also, to use philosophical language, the intelligibility of goodness. So, this darkness is obviously reflected in the words which are used to defend euthanasia. We've touched on the importance of words already. Euthanasia is called in Canada dignity with death. And of course, the title of the Canadian legislation, MAID, is obviously a euphemism. Recently, some poor young man in Canada suffering from depression requested MAID because he said, I'm quoting, "MAID is going to give me dignity." Presumably, he thought it dignified to control his own death. He could not wait for God, for that was too much suffering. It is odd to think that someone might be so fearful of suffering that they want to take their life, but that appears to be the case. People also say that they are taking their life through MAID because they do not want their family to have to watch them suffer, or that they will be able to leave more money to their children, which might otherwise be consumed in healthcare costs. The phrase death with dignity thus sounds appealing to those whose sense of autonomy requires control over life and death, and who, in a noble way, think of choosing death as a kind of self-sacrifice. That's the appeal. But to a Christian, that ought to ring false. This is not the nobility of Gethsemane, which appears and did appear to pagans, such as Pontius Pilate, as pathetic. Christians understand that to walk with Christ is to suffer, and the idea of redemptive suffering is supremely dignified. George Grant wrote, "Man is never more dignified than when he manages with whatever agony to say with Christ, 'Not my will, but thine be done.'" Or as G.K. Chesterton wrote, "God alone knoweth the praise of death." Another phrase, quality of life, is used to defend euthanasia and assisted suicide, and also we know of its history with abortion. This phrase, of course, suggests that life is a lesser good than quality of life. People say it is compassionate to refuse life-saving treatment to those who are mentally or physically handicapped, although there is no evidence that they would prefer to be dead. So we see here the phrase quality of life is indicative of a new view of life itself, the standard of the autonomous individual. But this term, as you probably also know, has an ambiguous history. Friedrich Nietzsche used the term quality of life to justify the merciless extinction of large masses of men. Abortion is defended as quality of life, yet it made protecting life much harder. So also with legalized euthanasia, we will see the destruction of long-held political freedoms. Now, Grant argued that part of this change can be traced to the new medical science of psychotherapy, whether methodologically Freudian or not, which has come to dominate the institutions of health in North America. The psychotherapist is now the gatekeeper, of course, to obtaining assisted suicide. Freud, as you know, developed the field of psychotherapy for the purpose of preserving mental health. He diagnosed the neuroses of his patients to have been caused by the internal tension between an irrational internal self, the id or self-will, and the pressures of living in society, and a moral code created by reason. A state of repression results caused by the repression of the id. Therapy serves to help the patient by balancing, of course, the inner desires with the external restraints. But in Freud's thought, pessimism is continually present because society and civilization, which are necessary to human well-being, cannot withstand the release of the id from bondage to mores. But neither can that repression or bondage be lessened without destroying civilization. Indeed, he intended psychotherapy to help people adjust. He did not extol the liberation of the id. Now, consider for a moment this very deep pessimism about the human condition. His theory expressed a deep ambiguity between the benefits to mankind that have come from civilization, its scientific and technological developments, and the study of psychical health that he does. Reason is repressive, yet necessary not only to civilization, but ironically also to the progress of his own science. The irrational and the rational stand in deep tension within the psyche and his own work. We are indebted to this rationalistic scientific civilization which had developed his psychotherapy, yet we are also repressed by it. And that instinctual self at the root of the psyche will, unfortunately, he thought, desire satisfaction someday. Thus, he took that long historical development of thought from Athenian philosophy, interpenetrated with the Judeo-Christian religion, to be the cause of repression, but because of that repression, the fate of civilization is uncertain. Freud always denied the perfectibility of man and society because of this fact that lying under the surface of human nature was this potential for aggression, and he ends his civilization and its discontents with a warning. Life is inherently tragic. The final rulers of human existence are love and death, eros and thanatos. When eros is sublimated, a death wish emerges. The will to life will be exchanged for a will to death. Euthanasia laws come about most certainly as the result of a will to death. People say we live in a world obsessed with sex, but is that the same thing as a will to life? No. I mean, as the previous speaker noted, obsession with gender is not at all the same as an interest in sex, nor is it an expression of love. Chesterton has some line about our culture being a fertility cult without the fertility. Well, I teach Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy each year, and it, by contrast, illustrates the Christian teaching on love, as it should be. Love in us is intended to be fulfilled, not repressed. The whole of the Divine Comedy portrays love as divine, a divine love which enlightens our intellect through its grace and is fulfilled for him in the beatific vision. By comparison, in Freud, eros is demoted. It is not a means to beatitude, much less ordinary happiness. Today, unlike in the Middle Ages, people do not seem to be very motivated by eros or love. And I do think that is because there really is a kind of death wish. The devastation of war in the 20th century looks like self-hatred. Freud predicted that if the death instinct is released with all its potentialities for destruction, civilization will move to its destruction as it moves to its fulfillment. Very, very dark. And of course, if you think about Nietzsche, who is Freud's more or less contemporary, he called this death instinct by a different name, which is the will to power. And like Freud, he traced the underlying self-hatred of modern mankind to a rationalistic moral code developed out of Jerusalem and Athens. Both took human nature to be fundamentally irrational. Both said the great cause of internal suffering of mankind comes from the fact that man is an irrational creature subjected to this artificial morality that they have created. Nietzsche called that self-hatred ressentiment against a slave morality. Anyway, this pessimistic view of human nature has affected Europe, arguably, but it did not find such fertile ground in North America, as Grant observed. North America, is fundamentally commercial in its interests. I joke in class that Americans are happy nihilists, and the evidence of this is the way that Freud was received in this continent. Here, Freudianism was ever optimistic and revolutionary, of course, the sexual revolution. And the philosophy of pragmatism added the conviction that all problems could be resolved. Thus, Herbert Marcuse was more influential than Freud, as both Grant and Augusto Del Noce have argued. It's interesting how many parallels there are between their arguments. Marcuse combined Freudianism with Marxism, so transforming Freudian analysis into a positive recipe for the transformation of society beyond any natural limit in the hope of gratifying the self. It is here one sees the genesis of that idea of death with dignity, I believe. The utopianism of Marx, combined with the gratification of the id's desire to control, means that to kill oneself is seen in a beneficial light, not despair, not tragedy, but gratifying. I will finally be dignified. If I kill myself, I will gain a dignity I didn't have before. Commenting upon this many years ago, Grant wrote, "The Gnostic prophecy that instinct would be released from bondage to reason in the progressive and utopian dreams of Marx and Marcuse meant that people now will be reconciled at last in the union of freedom and happiness and will choose to go down to the grave when they so desire. Living beyond all good and evil, the only task remaining was to advance euthanasia laws because there is no fear of final judgment, which had been part of the older morality. Centuries of moral teaching and religious faith gone, life is dignified in death, and Grant wrote, "Here indeed we come close to the very center of modern man's image of himself. The most obvious implication of this is that evil cannot be called sin." To say that modern beings cannot admit that there is something called sin means that reality is meaningless. There is no standard for good and evil. Grant also said this about our contemporary condition. We seem also to hold that in taking our own lives, we will be able to overcome necessity. Now, necessity is, of course, one side of reality. It is the meaninglessness or fate, the things that happen to you by fate, the chances of life. The wheels of fortune, which you can see depicted on the floors of medieval cathedral, capture this too. I mean, it is a part of reality. And if you've read Simone Weil, you will have some sense of what Grant meant by necessity. It is the very stuff of life over which we cannot necessarily have control. And of course, euthanasia offers an opportunity to effectively, once and for all, act in the face of meaninglessness. It is, of course, a technological act in that sense. The perception that everything is necessity raises metaphysical questions, of course, about the view of reality at work today. And I think we've been talking about this already in other papers. Heidegger, as I said we were beings towards death. And what is implied by that? It means beyond the little perspectives in good and evil, there really is only meaninglessness. All is becoming or flux. Being is becoming, as it were. Although he had some hope that something new might be revealed, big B being. Friedrich Nietzsche, on the alternative, called this flux the eternal return of the same, in the face of which there is only the will to act. And thus all science, all reasoning, all inherited knowledge is viewed as a projection upon the chaos. Now, as an aside, I can't help but point this out again. Let me say, there's such an irony observing and writing about the greatest works of the human mind of our age, whether psychotherapy or philosophy, to see that they tell us that we are creatures of instinct, creatures who are fundamentally irrational, and yet writing great works of reasoning and logic. This obviously speaks to the intellectual darkness of the day. Anyway, well, how was necessity treated by some thinkers in the Christian tradition? And of course, this is why I just want to return to Dante for a moment, just to point out how, in fact, this is a wrong view, that we are irrational. At the very beginning of Western civilization, of course, Socrates said he was a lover of wisdom and remarked that love, eros for the good, was the central fact of life. It was an eros for the truth. The Gospels teach that Christ is love incarnate and wisdom himself. Is there something in that teaching which is more intellectually satisfying? Now, the Christian poet Dante took the desire, eros, to be the central motivating power of human life. He might not have been entirely surprised by Freud's theory. Both would have agreed that eros is the motivating power and the world cannot satisfy it. Dante's journey began in eros, a sense of love and grace awakened by the child Beatrice, but is fulfilled towards the end of his life in contemplation. The beatific vision, which he shares with Beatrice at that moment, all loves united. When in midlife and in frustration he fell into sin, he says he went through wild ways, seeking for false phantoms of the good, which promise made of joy, but never fully pay the score. Of course, what that means is that the necessity could not satisfy his loves. Technological rationality, Grant says, of course, denies this journey. It also denies sin and evil. The attempt to move beyond good and evil is fundamentally technological because directed towards control of necessity, not thought. You see, thought has been left out. Yet thought about sin and evil is indeed necessary to understand who we are. But nonetheless, the self-image of the day is we must act, will, define ourselves. Christians must face the situation, however, that they are living, of course, in a time when the greatest of our thinkers have claimed that the troubles that we're in today, that technological rationality, emerged out of Christian metaphysics united with Athens. Of course, that makes Dante and Socrates the problem. And so there's a kind of very deep problem in how people in the academic world view the past, which hides from them, as it were, solutions to the problem. And Grant, of course, said Heidegger is simply wrong. Heidegger's history of being is simply wrong. Technological rationality has not emerged out of the whole of Western metaphysics. At one point, Grant quoted Ernst Jünger, a correspondent and friend of Martin Heidegger, who was also an insightful critic of technological modernity. Jünger had written, "Technique, as the destroyer of every faith in general, is also the most decisive anti-Christian power which has appeared hitherto." Now, did our culture of death emerge out of Christianity? Heidegger's long response to Jünger, published in The Question of Being, stated that there's nothing left of that history except nihilism. And to recover metaphysics, we have to go over the line to a new metaphysics. Everything else will just deepen the nihilism. That's the intellectual question of our day, really. Of course, it's wrong, says Grant. It must be countered, although it's extraordinarily difficult. In A Platitude, a short piece called A Platitude, he made this point: all coherent languages beyond those which serve the drive to unlimited freedom through technique have been broken up in the coming to be of what we are. Therefore, it is impossible to articulate publicly any suggestion of loss, and perhaps even more frightening, almost impossible to articulate it to ourselves. We've been left with no words to which to cleave together and summon out of uncertainty the good which we may sense the dispossession. Well, what are the solutions to this problem? I mean, I hesitate for a moment to say that there are solutions, but clearly churches should not take up the language of modernity. It's just not possible. I also think there are various practical things that can be done on the small scale to deal with the culture of death as it emerges and as euthanasia laws become legalized, although I do think that our lawyers have to work against those. But in any case, Grant thought the complex and deep intellectual legacy of Platonic Christianity was also capable of responding to the overall narrative of civilizational death. At the scholarly level, the task is to counter the claim of Heidegger, particularly his teaching that the will to death, a will to overcome necessity, is the whole legacy of Western thought. So I must return, therefore, to the topic of the cross and suffering where I began. Even Plato could say that because we are creatures whose nature bears a resemblance to the divine, it was better to suffer injustice than to do it. And of course, that truth was made manifest in Christ and overcome in the resurrection. This is the order of reality, Grant argued, and that whatever metaphysical account of being we are left with today, it cannot, Heidegger simply can't address, he's saying, the great mystery of the cross. Nor does it have any relation to the words of Plato that the good is beyond being. Grant warned, "It is often said these days that the task of thinkers is to reclaim the possibility of an ontology which has been lost in the realization of technology. This is why Heidegger is so popular with many continental theologians. But to what degree those ontologies account for justice," he says, when justice really is not simply an account of being an ontology. It's an overriding order which we do not measure and define, but in terms of which we are measured and defined. And this is the crucial point. One might say, if I can say it this way, we are not irrational creatures. In fact, we have been given a power in our intellects to know God. So where Freud separates eros from intellect, Plato and Christ, the great teaching of the tradition, unite them. We can know God. And just to conclude, in his final essay, Faith and the Multiversity, Grant began with a question from Simone Weil, who was to Grant a greater thinker than Heidegger. Faith, Weil wrote, is the experience that the intelligence is enlightened by love. This is also said by Boethius as well as Dante. It is there also in Christ's command, be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And as said earlier, perfection in this sense, of course, is the final cause. God is the final cause. Faith transforms the Platonic desire for wisdom into a desire for the cross, to go back to pure love. Faith transforms that Platonic. The intellect is enlightened in love. It has been said that perfection is too difficult for mankind. Certainly Grant wrote, the intelligence and enlightenment by love is a terrible teaching in the literal sense of the word. Contemplate what happens to those who have been deeply illumined by that love. After the resurrection, Christ told Peter he must expect to be carried whither he would not. So whatever we are called to do or make in the world, freedom to do and make cannot be the final account of what we are. Thus, Plato and Christianity are as one against the thinkers of authentic freedom, he said. Heidegger writes that Nietzsche's dictum, God is dead, means that God of morality is dead. Now, indeed, Christianity is not a morality, nor is it a morality tinged with emotion. We have been told rather, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. That is not a shallow morality. It is an affirmation of the deepest need of the soul, the image of God within the soul, mirroring God's love back to him. Hence the great irony that we have created a scientific knowledge culture, which is a culture of death, speaking the word love continually, speaking of dignity, speaking of compassion, worshiping science as a means to that end. But the language cannot entirely disguise the coldness and death at its heart. And thus, this unfathomable sadness, unfortunately, is more and more expressed in a will to legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia. Thank you.